Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the third seminar in the Water in the Native World webinar series, featuring papers in a special issue I was the guest editor for. Papers are about water challenges facing tribes, where Indigenous scientists and community members, as well as Indigenous students, lead the research and are involved in addressing the challenges. You can download the special issue at ucower.org. I placed the link in the chat box below. Today's seminar is entitled Arsenic Concentrations in Ground and Surface Water Across Arizona, Including Native Lands by Catherine Proper and Marie Jones. I also encourage you to catch our next webinar, which will be next Wednesday at the same time, 2 p.m. MST, which will be on Change Rippling Through Our Waters and Culture by Christine Martin et al. In today's talk, the authors compile online water quality databases to understand visually the arsenic concentrations in groundwater and surface water in Arizona, resulting in over 33,000 water samples collected from 1990 to 2017. What they found was that nearly 20% of the water samples exceeded the arsenic MCL, and in particular, 40% exceeded the arsenic MCL in Pinal and Yavapai counties. The public databases display a lack of water quality information on arsenic on tribal lands in Arizona, especially in Fort Apache, Navajo, Hopi, San Carlos Apache, and Tohono O'odham nations. The maps that the authors created are a tool for decision makers to address water quality disparities and risks that exist across Arizona, particularly on tribal lands. I'd like to introduce the speakers for this webinar series today. Marie Jones and Dr. Catherine R. Proper. Marie Jones began this project while attending Northern Arizona University as an undergraduate student working with Dr. Proper. It developed into a statewide mapping project in order to gain a more complete picture of the extent of arsenic contamination. Her research and clinical interests are focused on ecotoxicology, specifically arsenic, and how this impacts human health. Marie is currently studying nursing at Brigham Young University, Idaho, with the intent to pursue graduate school as a nurse practitioner. Dr. Catherine R. Proper has been a professor of biological sciences at NAU since 1991, where she's been dedicated to supporting students from underrepresented backgrounds. She's a director for the National Institute of Health, RISE for Native American Students, and the Minority Health International Research Training Program. Native Americans Exploring Global Health Disparities. Dr. Proper is co-lead for the Southwest Health Equities Research Collaborative Research Infrastructure Core. Her research focuses on how environmental contaminants affect development, reproduction, and behavior, and she's published on more than 60 peer-reviewed journal articles. Locally and statewide, she's served as the City of Flagstaff's Contaminants of Emerging Concern panel and the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality Advisory panel on emerging contaminants. Nationally, she's participated in several U.S. Environmental Protection Agency scientific advisory panels. And she can be contacted at catherine.proper@nau.edu, and I will place that into the chat box. At this time, I'll go ahead and transfer the platform over to Marie Jones and Dr. Proper. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chief. We really appreciate that lovely introduction. I'd also like to thank my co-authors on this manuscript, Jonathan Credo, who you guys heard about last week. He's an MD, PhD student at the University of Arizona. He contributed significantly both to parts of the introduction and the discussion. Dr. Janie Ingram, you all heard from last week. She has a lot of expertise in both arsenic and uranium in water systems and in animals and plants. Dr. Julie Baldwin is in the Department of Health Sciences. She's the director of the Southwest Health Equity Research Consortium. Dr. Robert Trotter and I share the lead in the Research Infrastructure Corps for that, and he's a professor in anthropology at NAU. I'd like to tell a little bit more about how Marie came to participate in this project. She was initially a sophomore in my class, in my lab, and we were starting her project on arsenic. She came to me after doing quite a bit of literature search and said, I may have a problem. And I said, what's that? She said, I'm pregnant. And I usually do not allow my pregnant students to work with toxicants that can affect their outcome of their pregnancy. But I'm also pretty creative in finding alternatives. So what we did was we had Marie start on a project looking at arsenic, primarily first in the Verde Valley. And she'll tell you a little bit more about her history there. At the same time, Doctors Baldwin, Ingram, and Trotter and I were beginning our conversations with the Yavapai Apache Nation about their problems with arsenic in their water system. So we pulled together this idea that Marie could map the arsenic, what's known about arsenic in those waters from the public databases. From there, it expanded out into all of northern Arizona. And from there, it expanded further out into the rest of Arizona and ultimately this manuscript and presentation. So I want to congratulate Marie on her both stick-to-itiveness and her excitement about this project. All right, with that, I want to give a little bit of an introduction about what arsenic is in the environment. Arsenic is a metalloid. It's inorganic. It comes in different forms. It comes in an inorganic form in a couple of different oxyanions. There's the trivalent form, or arsenite, and the pentavalent form of arsenate. It can be pretty mobile and go into solution under reducing conditions, and Dr. Ingram talked about this a bit last week. And you find it more commonly in groundwater than you find some of the other metals or metalloids. Arsenic can be converted from its inorganic form into an organic form. And so what you have is, in the inorganic form, it is very toxic. And again, you have the arsenite and the arsenate. Biological systems have the ability to methylate those arsenic elements or compounds and add this CH3 group, or a methyl group, to the arsenic. That can detoxify it to a certain degree. You have monomethylated arsenic and dimethylated arsenic. Dimethylated is considered to be the least toxic. For a long time, people thought monomethylated wasn't very toxic as well, but we now know that both the mono and the dimethylated arsenic may have some levels of toxicity, and some of this is still under debate. There's a lot of different sources of arsenic exposure, and inhalation's one. Arsenic can get into the air system, into our atmosphere, through things like volcanoes. But also, I always like to show this picture of my hometown, Los Angeles. It looked like this a lot in the 70s when I was growing up. And we now know that there was a lot of arsenic pollution, and still is in large cities where pollution is predominant. Of course, smoking is another source of inhalation for arsenic. Ingestion is another way in which arsenic can get into our systems. This is largely in the methylated form of arsenic, but not always. Food such as shellfish, fish, chicken in particular, lately we found quite a bit of arsenic in chicken. Rice has been in the news a lot lately with the levels of arsenic as a contaminant in rice. And of course, Dr. Ingram's working on arsenic in some of the food resources up on Navajo. Arsenic can also get onto your skin from wood products. A number of wood products are treated for and preserved with arsenic products. And while it doesn't readily go through your skin and into your system, if it's on your skin and then you go to eat something, that can get into your system as well through ingestion. But I'll also talk a little bit more about skin and wound healing towards the end of the talk. Water, of course, is what we'll be talking about today, and water is one of the main sources of arsenic contamination and intake in human populations. And a lot of this arsenic can be naturally occurring as well. And again, I'll get back to that in the discussion. Populations with the least access to water treatment technologies, however, are the ones that are most at risk of from all of these exposures. Now, arsenic is linked to a number of diseases, including autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and cancers. It can influence cancers through a number of potential molecular pathways that include inflammation, oxidative stress, inducing cell proliferation when it shouldn't happen, impacting DNA repair systems that are important in preventing cancer, and inducing or changing cell cycle controls and the programmed cell death that is part of regulating whether or not cells become carcinogenic. Arsenic can also lead to skin lesions, and that's when you ingest it, it can influence the skin function, and that can lead ultimately to increased wounds and increased risk of infection. The relationship between arsenic and diseases is very complicated, and we're just now beginning to recognize all the different pathways that are involved. And it can depend, as I said, on the species of arsenic, whether it's the organic or inorganic form of arsenic, whether the arsenic's getting methylated or not. What is the exposure concentration? How long are people being exposed? What's the life history and timing of exposure? That is, exposure in utero may have different outcomes than exposures later in your life. And individual variation in people in metabolism of that arsenic anion, or the organic arsenic into the methylated format can also have an effect. And we're finding that different populations have different capacities for that methylation. I want to talk a little bit about some of the history of arsenic in drinking water and our understanding of its toxicity. And this goes back to an effort in Bangladesh that was actually taken on in order to improve water quality. And so in Bangladesh, they were finding that a lot of the water quality for people was contaminated with microbial contaminants that were leading to a lot of very serious diseases. And so in the search for clean water, wells were dug, deep wells were dug into aquifers that did not have that microbial contamination. And when those wells were dug, nobody tested it for arsenic. And unfortunately, a lot of that arsenic was well above 50 parts per billion. And it led to the largest toxic outcome in people in the world globally. And more than 35 million people were exposed to high levels of arsenic that ultimately induced health problems. So in 1993, the World Health Organization lowered the limit to 10 parts per billion. And the US EPA followed suit 8 years later and gave the water utilities until 2006 to meet this new standard of 10 ppb in drinking water systems. So I always like to tell people how much is really a part per billion, because that seems like a really, really little amount of any compound in water, and certainly of arsenic. And when I give talks to other groups, often the chemical industry will make the point in trying to state that that really isn't all that much, that one that the levels in the water are just a drop in an Olympic-sized pool. And I kind of got tired of hearing that, because biologically what's effective is whatever influences your biological system. And as an endocrinologist, which is what I am, we know that our physiological systems work at either the part per billion or even down to the part per trillion level. So if something's in our system at the parts per billion level, it has the potential to have biological activity. So I did the math, because I kind of got tired of hearing about that. And it turns out that 1 part per billion is about 1/5 of a teaspoon of arsenic or any compound in an Olympic-sized pool. So it literally is a drop in an Olympic-sized pool. And that can have biologically important ramifications. All right, this paper I thought was interesting in doing this, in searching the literature for this talk. I always like to make sure I'm up to date on the latest and greatest. And this paper came out 1 month ago. So this group went and looked at the global arsenic contamination in groundwater to see which populations were potentially most at risk. And as you can see, a number of areas in the United States pop up, as do places in Argentina and a number of places in Asia. These researchers drew on 55,000 different samples in order to create this map. And remember, in Arizona alone, we were able to accumulate 33,000. And also notice there's a lot of gray area on these maps where either they didn't have access to the data, or those data have not been collected. There's no sampling. So in the US, Ayeto et al. Derived this map from groundwater, and you can see that there's a number of samples in the state of Arizona, as well as the rest of the country, where those dark blue dots represent exceedances above 10 parts per billion. So in a good bit of the country, the groundwater still is having exceedances above 10 parts per billion. And municipalities need to treat that water now to bring it down below 10 parts per billion. This is an older map that pretty much found the same thing from the USGS back from 2001. So not much has really changed between 2017 and our understanding in 2001. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the history again of our mapping project. So it started with some conversations with the Yavapai Apache Nation about their concerns about arsenic in their water systems, because they wanted to expand their agricultural production. And from there, working with Marie, we used her skills to start evaluating what was going on across the northern part of the state. And eventually, we moved into the rest of the state of Arizona, and this is what was published in the special issue that Doctors Chief and others pulled together. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Marie to give you some of the methods and the results of this project.
All right, thank you, Dr. Proper. If you can go ahead and go on to the next slide for me. So just a little bit about my history, as it's kind of been alluded to already. I came to be on this project because of an interest I had specifically in the Verde Valley, which is where I grew up. I grew up going out down to the Verde River on a regular basis and seeing the slag piles from the mining, and had been curious on what that had done to the water. And so I talked to Dr. Proper about doing this project, and here we are. So just a little bit about my methods. Beginning, I started with these two websites, which are listed here and also in that article. And I have been informed that one of them is no longer functioning, and that is, I think, due to like the system or their site updating. So the information should still be available, just maybe a little bit different route to get to it. But at the time, what I did was narrow it down by state, starting with Arizona, and then to county, initially just starting with Yavapai County, and then, as Dr. Proper said, moving to the rest of the state of Arizona. And then we started with a date range of 1990 to 2017, specifically May. And that just being, I started gathering the information in May of 2017, so we thought that would be a good point to stop looking for new information so that we didn't end up with duplicates and such. And then I was able to choose water as the activity medium. They had several different options, including soil as well, to see what the contamination levels were there. And then I chose arsenic and all of its derivatives in order to be able to see what the contamination levels were in the water. From there, I exported that data into an Excel document. And then once all of that was compiled in an Excel document, which I'll show you a snippet of in a couple of slides, I ended up with over 33,000 samples. And then that was then created into an XY table using ArcGIS 10.4 software. And that then was converted into a shapefile. And a shapefile is just how the XY table was overlaid over a map, the X and the Y referring to latitude and longitude. So that way that it showed up on the map with the corresponding location with the right sample for that site. And this allowed for the production of the maps that we have made, which we'll show you here in just a moment. I do want to point out that we do have the link here available for that, that map and those shape files. Unfortunately, you do have to have access to ArcGIS software to use the full capabilities that are available there. But if you are able to access that, it shows you not only what the arsenic level was at that particular site, but it also provides the date that the sample was taken, as well as the organization that reported the information, and any other pertinent information that you can't actually see just by looking at the map. And we will get that link put in the chat. Thank you, Carlotta, for that suggestion. Next slide, please. All right, and at this time, I actually would like to give a quick shout out to Carlotta Chief and Jacqueline Krim, as well as two of our anonymous reviewers. They provided some critical criticism, I guess, or suggestions. Suggestions is probably a better way to put that, to improving our study and specifically our maps. One of those suggestions was to add the jurisdiction boundaries for the tribal lands in Arizona so that we can actually visualize what samples were taken in those areas. And then also suggested that we overlay it with the rivers of Arizona, which give us a better idea of where those surface sites were taken from. And then because I was able to add this information, we were able to extrapolate some more specific information for each of the tribal jurisdictions, which we'll go into a little bit later as well. The next slide, thank you. All right, so this is that Excel document snip that I was talking about just a moment ago. This is kind of what it looks like as well if you were to access it using the ArcGIS link that we had on that previous slide. It just goes over the website that it originally came from, the date that I pulled that information, and then who provided that information, as well as the location type. You'll see here that there's surface water, groundwater, and then not available. And we'll get into what that not available specifically means a little bit later on. There's also the latitude and longitude, as well as the date that the sample was taken and the original units provided and concentration level of arsenic. Next slide, thank you. All right, so this is that first map. So this is the groundwater concentration sites specifically. Then if you look here on the key, you'll see that that smallest red circle represents the 0 to 10 parts per billion, which is within that EPA regulatory limit. And then from there, the next size up circle, which is also a little bit darker, is 10.1 to 100 parts per billion. And then the largest red circle, which is also the darkest, is greater than 100 parts per billion. We thought it was important to have those different ranges on there to get a better idea of how high of concentrations there are throughout the state. So as you can see, those two larger symbols represent everything that is over that EPA regulatory limit. Looking at the map, you can tell that there is a little bit of lack of information that is publicly available in those tribal jurisdictions, which if we were to be able to get that information, it would give us a better idea of what we're looking at for water quality in those areas. There is a little bit more sampling, specifically in Yavapai along the Verde River. And that does show that there are quite a few samples that were taken that are above that EPA limit. And then Hopi does have a few samples that have been taken as well, and that also reflects that there are several over that EPA limit. Then here we have the surface water map, which looks very similar to the previous. Again, there is a lot of information that is not available on here, just for areas that either sampling hasn't been done, or since this is Arizona, there is a lot of desert and not surface water readily available, and so samples haven't been taken there. Specifically in some of the tribal jurisdictions, Tohono O'odham, there isn't really any samples that have been made available in that area, so we don't know what that arsenic concentration looks like. Looking along the Colorado River and along the Verde River, you can see that a lot of those samples that have been reported are above that 10 EPA limit. Right. Okay, so this map specifically shows the sample sites that were taken that were unspecified. And what had happened is some of the websites that I had gathered the information from did not specify whether or not it was ground or surface water. And so even though some of them you are able to assume whether it was ground or surface water just based on the location, whether it's along the river or whatnot, we didn't want to make those assumptions and misrepresent anything. But we felt that it was still important to include this data just because there is a lot of information here that wasn't available on the other two maps. Again, it shows a lack of public information for many of the tribal jurisdictions. And then also, again, a lot of those areas along the rivers, the Gila River, the Verde River, and the Colorado River all show samples that were taken that were above that 10 parts per billion EPA limit. Next slide. I do want to address a question real quick. I saw that there was a question that popped up asking if Janie Ingram's data had been included. It had not been included in this, so there is more information that is available now. At the time that we were working on this publication, her information had not been published yet, so we didn't have access to that for these maps. So that does show you right there that there is more information available that just wasn't able to be pulled into this at the time. So this map here does show all three layers, the surface water, the groundwater, and the unspecified data, all on one map, which really paints a picture of the areas that do need further sampling or just that don't have publicly available information at this time, specifically in those tribal areas. Next slide.
Okay, hang on one second. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Oh,
We're there.
there we go, thank you.
We're glitched for the
Okay,
moment.
so this slide here shows the information that we were able to pull from the map in a little bit different way. This has the different counties broken down by square miles, and then also by the samples that were taken in that specific county. And then, as was mentioned by Carletta in our introduction, there are, of all of the samples taken, which total 33,099, 20.7, almost 21% of those samples came back with arsenic concentrations above 10 parts per billion. There are two counties in particular I want to mention because they kind of drove that average up. And that was being Pinal and Yavapai County. Pinal County having 48.1% that were above the EPA limit, and then Yavapai having 43.6% above that EPA limit. Just on a personal note, this was particularly kind of concerning for me just because my father grew up in Pinal County and my mother grew up in Yavapai County. So both of them were in areas that had higher arsenic samples taken. Next slide. All right, and then this table again was made possible thanks to the suggestions made by Carletta and Jacqueline, as well as our reviewers. We went ahead and made a table that was similar to that for the counties, but for the tribal jurisdictions. So each of the tribal jurisdictions is listed here, and then the square kilometers of that jurisdiction in order to give a better idea of the type of area that we're looking at. And then we broke it down by sample ranges that correspond with those on the map, and then include the total number of samples. By looking at the data this way, it kind of brought to light a couple of key things that we thought were noteworthy. The first being that there are several jurisdictions that didn't have any or hardly any samples that had been publicly made available. And so we just highlighted that here for information. And then the second set of circles, the red circles here, corresponds with those that have had significant or at least more adequate sampling done, but that a lot of those samples were above the EPA limit of 10 parts per billion, with, like, for example, Fort McDowell having 86 samples that have been reported of 157 that were over that EPA limit. All right, and with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Dr. Proper to do our discussion.
Okay, and I did see that some people were having some trouble maybe hearing me. I'll try to shout and get a little closer to my microphone. So why is there so much arsenic in the ground and surface water in Arizona? And a lot of this is because of just our geology. There tends to be a lot of arsenic in the geological sources, and then that leaches into the groundwater in the aquifer. And as well as the fact that because we don't have a lot of surface water, a lot of wells are dug, and these deep water wells end up hitting those geological formations that contain a lot of arsenic. There are in particular large deposits in Yavapai County, so therefore it's not surprising that in Yavapai you see so much arsenic, both in the ground and surface water. However, we can't ignore mining, as Dr. Ingram and the other Ms. Jones, Lindsay Jones, talked about last week. Mining can have a significant impact in that it goes through those different geological structures and disrupts them and potentially releases more of that arsenic into the groundwater systems. And then last, agriculture can play a role as well. Arsenic is sometimes part of pesticide formulations. It gets sprayed and then released into the surface water systems during runoff events. So I want to address why there may be such a lack of information for many of the tribal jurisdictions. And it could be that there's a lack of sampling. Sampling's expensive. It takes some technical knowledge and often shipping the samples out for expensive analysis. There could also be lack of public disposition of the samples. The tribes own the data, rightfully, and they maintain their own water utilities. So approvals there then are necessary for publishing in the public databases. And so the tribes themselves may have access to these data and may be using those data to work towards mitigation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with Hopi and Navajo. Another problem, and this is a problem not just for arsenic, but I've found it's a problem for pesticides all over the world and other contaminants, is that public identification can lead to social or local problems and stigmatization that can lead to an inhibition for continued sampling because they don't have access to mitigation. And so all of those issues may be contributing to why we're not seeing this in the tribal jurisdictions, this information. I do want to emphasize that this is a pretty long-term problem. As we all know, we're under global climate change conditions. I just pulled up the map at the top during the weekend. This is the current US drought monitor system for Arizona that the USGS has. And as you can see, the northeastern part of the state and part of the southeastern part of the state are currently under drought conditions. The long-term, meaning just for the next few months, drought conditions that we're expected to experience are going to just get more severe for many parts of the state. And then, of course, we have the very long-term outcome of global climate change that's going to show that, suggests strongly that Arizona is just going to get warmer. And we're going to need access to our water systems, probably from our aquifers. Understanding the geochemistry of our region is critical to then understanding what mitigation programs do we need to start working towards now for our drinking water systems. So the predictions for arsenic in groundwater also come from this Ayeto paper. A good portion of the domestic wells that they sampled had levels above 10 parts per billion, and they used that to create this prediction map. And as you can see from the prediction map, a lot of Navajo and Hopi are predicted to have high levels of arsenic, as we've already seen through a number of samples. And the regions where there's a lack of sampling is a place where risk looks low, but we're not sure if risk is low if people don't have access to or haven't yet collected the data. And so doing predictive modeling is only as good as your availability of data to make those predictions. So what can be done to limit arsenic exposure? And as Dr. Ingram and Ms. Jones talked about last week, and as I mentioned in the earlier part of this talk, arsenic chemistry is very complicated, and mitigating arsenic is also complicated. Hopi have had the Hopi Arsenic Mitigation Project going for probably about 10 years. The tribe has received some, but not all, of the projected $45 million they need from the federal government and from the tribe to complete this project. They have drilled wells into an aquifer that does not have a lot of arsenic in it. It meets the drinking water standards, but they need to be able to transport that water to the villages and households on Hopi, and getting the funds to do that has been very problematic. In the meantime, even though the tribe is trying to mitigate this through this program, the tribe was fined by the federal government for not resolving the issue of high concentrations of arsenic exceeding the drinking water limits in these systems. And I believe they were fined more than $52,000, and they finally settled recently for about $3,000 in fines. They do hope to have the project complete by 2023. Navajo could receive $1 million for some arsenic treatment in the Aneth public water system. And as of April, this public water system still is having exceedances of the 10 parts per billion. So this isn't just an Arizona problem. Arsenic is in water that may impact indigenous people across the continental US. And so what I've done here on the left is pull up a map, and I don't love this map, but it's the map of indigenous Indian American population percentages by county. And it doesn't really reflect the indigenous populations in all of that kind of light pink area, just because compared to the rest of the population, it's low. If you overlay that with these arsenic prediction maps, you can see that a number of the indigenous populations, in particular in Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Nevada, Washington, Montana, and the Dakotas, could be impacted. These other areas, again, are very green, but again, they're green because maybe there hasn't been appropriate sampling. And then if you even go farther out into global populations, there's an extreme lack of knowledge about the degree of health outcomes of arsenic exposure risk from water or other resources for indigenous people globally. And again, this is that global map from that paper that just came out last month. And on the left, we have a global map of indigenous peoples. And you can see that again, in Mexico in particular, the Southwest United States, parts of Cambodia, where there's a large indigenous population, in Bangladesh, there's high risk of arsenic exposure. And yet there's still a lot of gray area, in fact, mostly gray area on those maps. It tells us that we aren't completely informed about what's going on. Now, in this paper, they took a look at the proportion of globally affected areas. And you can see again, Asia by land area has the highest risk of exposure. Asia by population also has the highest risk of exposure. Africa by population comes next. North America, they're predicting not a lot of high risk of exposure by population, but if you overlay the indigenous lands there, it's the indigenous populations that may be at highest risk and may have the least resources to mitigate that risk. All right, last week I was taking notes while people were giving their talks, and the last couple of weeks, and somebody asked a question about what are the health outcomes from arsenic exposure. So I thought I'd add a little bit of information there as well. And the Strong Heart study began in 1989, looking at a lot of different health outcomes for indigenous populations in North Dakota, South Dakota, the Dakotas, Oklahoma, and Arizona. And as part of that project, they were looking at the impacts of arsenic. And so in 2009, a paper was published where they evaluated people over 10 years, looking at arsenic concentrations in urine as a surrogate for what their exposure risk was. And they found that the levels were low to moderate and that they were highest in Arizona populations. Then there are 3 papers that have just come out in the last year. One showed that food resources, and in particular organ meat and rice, were deemed potential dietary sources. And I know Dr. Ingram is looking at that right now on Navajo. Then there's a number of health outcomes as well. And these papers literally just are hot off the press. And one is that low to moderate arsenic exposure is associated with increased risk for restricted lung disease. And when I read this, it made me a little bit queasy, given what's going on right now with COVID and the fact that this COVID-19 pandemic impacts lungs very strongly. And then last, and this one also was a bit tummy turning, is that maternal levels of arsenic are associated with increased potential risk of type 2 diabetes in the offspring, which means we're seeing cross-generational effects. So how are these biological effects manifested? And as I said, the chemistry of arsenic is complicated, and so is the biochemistry when you look at it in looking at it with the ideas of disease outcomes. So I pulled in here just a little schematic of all the different proteins that arsenic can interact with in this network of interactions. And we know that arsenic affects a number of cancers. And now in our lab, we're looking at the impacts of arsenic on breast cancer. The picture on the right is a picture of a larval zebrafish that we've used to xenograft or inject tumor cancer cells in order to better evaluate the in vivo effects of arsenic on cancer. It's also associated with diabetes. Diabetes can lead to an increased risk of wounds. We're also studying the impact of arsenic on wounds and wound healing. And this is a study of tissues in cell culture. So these are just cells that we put an artificial wound in. On the left, you can see our wound across these cells. And then over time, on the top, you see that wound closes. But when we expose these cells first and during the wounding process to arsenic at levels below the US EPA drinking water limit, it slows that wounding process down. And we're concerned that people with diabetes who have wounds then in regions of high levels of arsenic may actually be at risk for slowing of wound healing and therefore increased risk of infection. With that, I just want to remind you of everything we've talked about. A lot of this is within some of the documents provided by the World Health Organization. I've provided the link here on this talk. The most important action the World Health Organization says that affected communities can do in the prevention of further exposure to arsenic is by provision of a safe drinking water supply. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge again Doctors Chief and Krim and the anonymous reviewers for greatly improving this manuscript and giving it a little bit more of a flair towards understanding the risks associated to Native American populations. And I'd also like to thank Chairwoman Jane Russell-Winnecki and Mr. Robert Mills from the Yavapai Apache Nation for helping us start off all of this. And then, of course, all of our funders, the NIH and the Arizona Department of Health Services through their ADRC program. And with that, all of us who put together this presentation and the manuscript would like to thank you for your attention, and we're happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Proper and Marie, for this excellent presentation. And at this time, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. And we would all give you an applause if we were all in the same room. So I would like to go ahead and list some questions that were in the chat box. A comment was made by Sharon Megdal. She mentioned that in today's news, it was reported that a bottled water had arsenic levels close to 10 parts per billion, and I think it's a Whole Foods bottled water. So that was alarming. She also wanted to know if you had seen the article by DC Corey that was on environmental justice and enforcement of safe drinking water at the Arizona Arsenic experience.
I had not seen that article, but I would love to see it. Would you please email that to me?
Yes, I provided the link in the chat.
Okay.
You can get the PDF online. I just by way of explanation, I see you did cite the work by Christine Ullman and Channa Rock, but I know even before that, some ag and resource economists were looking at maps of arsenic. So that's why I searched that and found that. So
Right.
take a look.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I do. I know U of A has also published some maps of their own as well. So thank you. I will look up that article.
So Mary Kay O'Rourke, actually, it would be great if we can engage in dialogue rather than me reading the questions. So Mary Kay, could you ask your question? Mary Kay O'Rourke.
Hi, Mary Kay.
I don't know if she's still on the line, but I'll go ahead and read her question.
Okay, that's all right.
She said, do the data include data through time? Are you looking at the data prior to the change in arsenic level to 10 parts per billion?
So I'm going to let Marie answer that question.
Yes, so the data range from January 1st of 1990, which was prior to that change, to May 1st of 2017. And then I think this addresses another question that I saw in the chat as well. If you were able to access that map, for instance, if you click on a specific site, it will tell you all of the samples that were drawn over time and what those corresponding levels were. So it does show like what the different levels were at different times and at different draws.
Okay, it's great that you have that database available. Another question was from Olivia Miller. I don't see her on the line. Oh, she's there. Olivia, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, she kind of just answered it with the if there's data over time. And I guess I was kind of curious, you have the tables of the numbers of concentrations in different areas at different levels. And, you know, would you have like a site that could have fallen into two of those categories? I don't, just kind of curious about how you handled the time aspect of your huge data set.
So Honestly, I just included all of the different samples from those two websites over that time span. So like there were some sites that have been sampled dozens of times. And so those were included in the data set, in the 33,000 samples. And that was just because even though some of them are more current draws than others, it still kind of allowed people to like paint a picture of what the pattern of the concentrations has been. And make decisions based off of that. I don't know if that answered your question specifically.
Yeah, it did. Thanks. No, this is really interesting.
Yeah,
It would be really nice if either we or somebody accessed the database and we could see along some river systems whether or not there's dramatic changes over time. Especially I think in regions of mining, in regions of agriculture, whether or not those levels are changing, associated with those different kinds of environmental disturbances.
Yes, and I think the chats, the questions posed are along those lines, like looking at other parameters and potential correlations, such as correlation between arsenic levels and depth of well, potentially, you know, depending on what aquifers you're drawing from, and then also if the samples were filtered or non-filtered, and the analytical methods that were employed.
To speak to that, so the different websites that I pulled information from, some included more detail about the specific samples than others. I don't recall off the top of my head if they included any of the methods, but I know that there were some that showed like whether it was dissolved or total in the sample. And that information is available through those websites that I pulled the original data from, as well as in the map. I included as much as I could as to each sample site. So if you were to pull up that map off of the link that we provided, you can click on a specific sample and as much information as I had is linked to that. So whatever they gave me, I included in there.
So the maps themselves are interactive.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Steve Simkin at ASU provided some links related to maps that are geological origin of arsenic in Southwest groundwater from geological surveys that might be useful.
Thank you.
All right, I see those there. Thank you. Yes. I see a couple of questions that may be more Kathy geared, but I don't know if you want to read them off, Carlotta, or you would like me to.
Sure. Is Maureen McCarthy on the line? Great to see you from Native Waters on Arid Lands.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. You want to ask your
Thanks,
question?
Carlotta.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so a couple questions for you, and I'll actually pull the question that Carolina put up as well. The concept of watering crops with arsenic in it, is this, you know, can you talk about the uptake by crops of water that has arsenic in it? And the second question I had for you is the issue of remediation. What filtration techniques do we have available? In particular, I'm interested in understanding a little bit more about what was being done at HAMP, at the Hopi Mitigation Project, for mitigation, for remediation, not just drilling new wells. Thanks.
Sure, I can answer a little bit of those questions. I wish my colleague Janie Ingram was here because she's got a lot more expertise in that area, but I think she's on an airplane right now to Anchorage. So with regards to the first question with arsenic, using water that has arsenic in it on crops, I do know that different plants take up arsenic at in different ways and different levels, because again, that biology chemistry interface can get very specific. And so that was one thing that we were talking about with the Yavapai Apache Nation, was working with them and Janie to try to see if there were some crops that might be better at either pulling out the arsenic but not putting it into the part of the plant that's eaten? Or can we use certain plants around the crops to pull out the arsenic? I've seen a number of talks when I attend the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry conferences, where different people are starting to evaluate different plants, both for their ability to potentially act as a remediator for surface water arsenic, and also to see which ones might be least problematic for crops. So that research is underway, but I don't know that we have, I'm not familiar with the answers right now. Again, that gets a little bit out of my field. With regards to the Hopi Arsenic Mitigation Project, I looked up where they were now because about 7-8 years ago, Janie and a couple of other faculty members and I put together a grant to try to, in fact, evaluate the knowledge about arsenic in the water systems across Hopi, and also to test a tabletop filtration system. There is, in Bangladesh, people put together an inexpensive iron-based filtration system about 15 years ago and deployed it and claims it worked. And in preparation for this talk, I was looking up how has that progressed? And there was not a lot of information out there to say one way or another whether that system functioned. We were unfortunate in that we did not get the funding to test our different filtration systems. We were just going to try some of the different commercial filtration systems. And we weren't able to go there. A couple of them claim that they do remove arsenic, but we were not able to independently verify that. One of the things they've done on Hopi for some of the school systems on the water systems is they have an independent arsenic filtration system with, it's a large matrix. We toured Hopi and looked at these systems. And the problem is they're very expensive. They require a lot of electricity. And the media needs to be changed pretty frequently, and the media is expensive. So, and those were limited to just, I think, a couple of the schools on Hopi. So really now, when I looked this week to see what was going on Hopi, the wells are dug. The wells were dug 8 years ago when we last visited. They have been evaluated, they are clean. And I think they're still looking for the funding to try to put in the pipelines to get the water there. But if anybody knows more about it than what I was able to pull up, I'd love to hear about it.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Popper. I do want to acknowledge that we have some tribal environmental managers who have joined this call, and directors, Joan Tamici, who's director of Native Nations Institute, Elaine Wilson of the Intertribal Environmental Professionals, and then Ronnie Ben, director at Navajo EPA, and Crystal Tully Cordova, who's a hydrologist at the Navajo Nation. So do we have any other questions, possibly from the tribal representatives on the line? Thank you for joining.
And please, if you have more information for me, I would appreciate it.
Okay, it doesn't sound like there are any other questions then. Thank you so much for your presentation,
Carletta?
Mary. Oh, yes.
Carletta, can I ask you a quick, the point you made, Kathy, about the correlation of arsenic exposure and potential lung issues. There's also a recent study that's come out about the exposure to particulate matter and its correlation to increased COVID symptoms. Both of these issues means that the arsenic issue and the particulate issue are connected, could be connected to COVID, which means that there's a good chance that if the tribes were looking to use some of the CARES funding, they could apply that to these remediation efforts or to these studies right now, since they seem to be connected to COVID cases. I know we're looking at this in another case, so I'm just throwing that out because it may be a nice opportunity to be able to do something about these issues with the CARES funding.
I think that's an outstanding suggestion and a very good way to use that funding to help support the tribes right now who are having such horrid issues associated with COVID.
Yep.
So I really appreciate that suggestion. And for those of you that have access to those funds, I think that would be an interesting pathway to take. It's the social justice issues associated with arsenic and uranium contamination, both locally and within the state of Arizona, and then globally, I think are huge and really need to be addressed.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, it's very relevant to today and this pandemic. I'll go ahead and end the webinar series here, but I encourage you to attend our next webinar, which is next Wednesday at the same time. And I'll be focusing on the Agawam spearing in the Portage Waterway, Michigan, integrating mixed methodology for insight on an important tribal fishery by Andrew Kojic et al. The registration link is in the chat box, and the recordings will also be available at that link as well. Thank you so much again to Marie and Kathy for their excellent presentation. And again, thank you to everyone for joining. Have a wonderful day.
Dr. Chief?
Yes.
Yeah, Ronnie Ben, can I just make a quick comment?
Yes, please do.
Yes, Ronnie Ben, Navigation EPA. As coming from a regulatory entity, we get a lot of outside contractors that like to come to Navajo and introduce and try to push on introducing some type of media to extract some of the arsenic. So it's really very good for me, and I really appreciate the studies that are happening, and I've learned quite a bit in this presentation. So your work is very much appreciated here on Navajo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. We appreciate all the work you're doing to try to protect the health of folks on Navajo.
Great. Thank you, Ronnie, for your comment and support. And we definitely want to continue working with tribes and helping with environmental challenges that they face, and also health, especially during these unprecedented times. So thank you again. Thank you to all those who joined in this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.